Hey, you guys, and welcome back to the Beginner's Garden Podcast. Today, we're talking about a very popular topic and one of my favorites, and that is companion planting. Why do you think companion planting is such a sought-after topic among gardeners, especially beginners? Is it because we truly think that one plant can help another? Is it because we want to employ this strategy to help repel harmful pests and help us to avoid pesticides? Maybe all of that is part of it, but I'd venture, especially for a gardener in a small space, the reason is much less complex. We simply want to plant more in that small space. Maybe we want to get more food in the same space, or maybe we want to add some pretty flowers that also do some double duty alongside our veggies. There is a lot online about companion planting, and I'm always open to new ideas to accomplish all of these goals. And over the years, I've tried many different combinations, even the ones that are supposed to be bad companions. While I'm still testing various combinations, it's so much fun to test from year to year. Today, I'm going to share with you 7 that I've found some success with. And many of them are staples in my garden plan each year. Before we get started today, I want to make sure you know that starting today, I am having a free class called the Productive Garden Masterclass. You can join today, tomorrow, which is Wednesday, or Thursday. We have 5 classes to choose from, just depending on what day and time works best with your schedule. And what you're going to learn is how to triple your harvest in half the time with the space you already have. We're going to talk about several strategies, and one of them is actually companion planting. Just for registering, even if you can't make it live, you will be entered into a giveaway that has some fantastic products from my partners, like a green stalk vertical planter, a Birdie's raised bed, a raised bed Garden in Minutes garden bundle with the garden grid, Zone Protects products, Organic Rev products, Epic Gardening products, a Rue, and more, even just for registering. So register at journeywithjill.net/masterclass with the time that works best for you. If you can't make it live, there will be a replay. But if you come live, many of these same partners will be doing giveaways for their products during the live masterclass. So we'll have some fun while learning some great things about helping you plan your garden. Also, today the doors officially open for Dream to Garden, my online garden planning course. And as one of the bonuses when you purchase, I wanted to make sure you know that, especially because you're tuning into this as we're talking about companion planting today, you'll get my Companion Planting 101 course, where I go more in depth with not only different companion planting strategies, but also the why behind whether a particular combination might or might not be a good idea. Don't forget, Dream to Garden doors are open only through February 13th. But first, I would love to see you in the free masterclass. You'll get strategies on companion planting and other topics you can take and use today. And you'll also learn a little bit more about Dream to Garden so you can decide if that is right for you right now. So let's get on to the 7 companion planting examples that I want to share with you today. Most of these are examples that I have used in my garden over multiple seasons, and I continue to use them year after year. A couple of them I've used once or twice, but I saw such good results that I wanted to share them with you, but I will tell you which ones those are so you can use that with caution. I think sometimes it's hard to draw a conclusion after just a year or two when you have good or bad, for that matter, experiences in the garden. So keep that in mind. You might want to test it on your own. But a couple of these are, for me in my garden, they are tried and true. And that is definitely the case with number 1. I love companion planting cucumbers and climbing nasturtium together to go up the same trellis. Now, nasturtium is this beautiful flower, and I admit I'm not a flower gardener. Flowers are not my specialty at all, but I do have a few that I grow that I've mastered how to grow, and nasturtium, I feel like, is one of them. Now, you can get 2 types of nasturtium. The main nasturtium that you will buy is more like a mounding type. I wouldn't really say a bush type, but the whole point is it really doesn't trail. It doesn't climb, it doesn't have a vine. So if you buy regular nasturtium, you're probably not going to get one that's going to go anywhere except for that little mound, which is beautiful. There's definitely places for that. And I do plant that in my garden and other places. But The nasturtium I'm talking about alongside cucumbers is the climbing nasturtium or the trailing nasturtium. You have to specifically look for one of those two words in the description in your seed catalog or vine, but most of the time I see it as trailing or climbing. And this has the same flowers as the other type of nasturtium. They look the same. Sometimes you can get different colors, but the growth habit is it vines. Now, if you put it next to a trellis, it's going to climb up the trellis just like a cucumber will. There's a couple of reasons I love this combination together. The first one is it's just pretty. Nasturtium is gorgeous, and having it climb a trellis alongside an edible crop like cucumbers is absolutely stunning in the garden. I will mention that nasturtium is edible itself, so you can use the little lily pad shaped leaves. I love that. To me, that's the most gorgeous part about this plant, is just how unique those leaves are. You can use the leaves and you can use the flowers in salads. It definitely is edible. That's kind of a side benefit. I just love the beauty in the garden. But another reason I like planting nasturtium alongside cucumbers is one issue that we often have in our gardens when we're growing cucumbers, especially early in the season, is we have trouble with pollination, with the bees coming to our cucumber blooms early in the season. This is something that I've seen year after year, not only with cucumbers, but also with squash. What my theory is, and I could be wrong, is that about the time that those early blooms start to come out is usually about the time when the wildflowers are in bloom and you have these gorgeous mats of fields. Hopefully you have this in your location, of all sorts of clovers and pollen producing plants that are feeding our bees. And what I have found, and I have 2 honeybee hives on my property within spitting distance of my garden, but that time of year, there's not a honeybee to be found in my garden. And my thought is, because are they going to choose one cucumber plant over a whole field of grasses that are flowering or some kind of plant like that? Probably not. So my thought is they are going elsewhere. But toward the middle of the season and the end of the season, I definitely see more bees in my garden. I think part of that is because there's not as many of the wildflowers available. So they are going to the parts that have more nectar and pollen available for them. So to counteract that, there are a couple of things we can do. One thing, and this is honestly what I've started going with more, is purchasing and planting a parthenocarpic variety of cucumbers, or squash for that matter. And that means that they are going to pollinate themselves. They don't need a bee for cross-pollination. Planting those earlier helps me to get more fruit earlier in the season. But if you don't plant that variety, it really can help to have the nasturtium alongside the cucumbers, because those nasturtiums are also going to attract the pollinators. They're going to attract the bees, and I mentioned honeybees because I have 2 honeybee hives, but honestly, my native bees and my bumblebees and my carpenter bees and all of that, they tend to, I feel like, do a better job in my garden. But those are the types of flowers that they tend to flock to. A lot of our blooming flowers that attract bees the best, we are not seeing them bloom till later in the year, like sunflowers. But nasturtium is kind of a tender annual in the fact that it can take a frost. It's kind of a cool season flower, so I can plant it early, get the blooms going early, and then it can attract those pollinators early on in the season and can help with pollination. This could be the case with the cucumbers and the cucumbers and a climbing nasturtium, but you can also plant those mounding nasturtium flowers around your squash as well. That's kind of a bonus tip. I don't think I have that in my list, but you can kind of get the idea. Planting a blooming flower that blooms early around your crops that need cross-pollination can definitely help. And that is my number 1 recommendation for companion planting. Number 2 is tomatoes, and either calendula or alyssum, or both. One reason I like calendula and alyssum next to my tomatoes is they are also early bloomers. They are more of your cool season flowers, not real fond. Alyssum can handle freezes. Calendula is not too fond of it, especially in the spring, but they're definitely early bloomers. So what they're going to do is they are amazing at attracting syrphid flies. Syrphid flies, if you haven't heard of them, they are a fantastic little beneficial insects. They're also known as hoverflies, and they will lay their eggs near areas where you've got an aphid issue. What I love about planting calendula and alyssum near my tomatoes is that the early tomatoes in my garden tend to be more susceptible to aphid pressure. And those early blooming calendula and alyssum will allow for the adult syrphid flies, and honestly, this is the case with lady beetles as well, to have nectar and also lay their eggs in the same vicinity. This would be a good companion too with peppers for the same reason. Also, they're just beautiful, and they're pretty compact plants. They're not going to overwhelm an early tomato plant, so you can plant them about the same time, and they play really nicely together. I have a video where I actually talk about several tomato companions that I've used in the past. I think I have 10. I'll link that in the description or the show notes so that you can watch that. There's lots of tomato companions. But in that video, you can see calendula and alyssum and how it's kind of a plant that goes beside the tomato as kind of an understory plant that to me is just fantastic at attracting those beneficial insects besides being just absolutely gorgeous flowers. Number 3 is a combination that I'm not sure that I used before last year. I may have, and I've just done it in the past, but last year I saw how amazing of a combination this was, and that was peppers and carrots. In my particular climate, I am planting carrots early in the season, usually early March. Our average last frost date is mid-April, so I'm planting my carrot seeds early March. Peppers are actually not going to go in until the late part of April, the early part of May, just depending on how the weather patterns go. So you may think, okay, how can peppers and carrots be companion plants if they're planted it's such different times, the carrots going in March and the peppers going in late April, early May. Technically, this is more of a relay planting, which is a form of succession planting in that I can plant the carrots and then make room for putting the peppers in later. But while they're growing together, they definitely are fantastic companions. There are a couple of reasons for this. At least the way that my season shakes out, and you may want to consider how your season goes, but for me, carrots do the best in full sun early in their life. They're not what you want to plant underneath something to get shade. I've even tried to do that at the end of the summer, plant carrots under the shade of something when it got really hot, and they just did not do well because they need full sun. Well, if I'm planting them in March, they're going to be getting full sun from the time they germinate all the way through until I plant those young pepper seedlings up to 8 weeks later. And by that time, when I put the young peppers in the garden, there's lots of sun, the days are longer, the peppers are not very tall, so they're not shading out the carrots at all. By the time they get tall, where they actually are casting shade, this is really the time of year where in my climate in Arkansas, the carrots could then benefit from some shade to keep the soil a little bit cooler. By that point, they're pretty much to full maturity, or if not close. So this is a really good companion for me because it kind of helps extend that carrot harvest a little bit more, which is a little bit difficult to do in the summer because carrots really like cool weather. They don't like the heat. Another thing is that the carrots benefit the peppers in that they tend to attract lady beetles, which if you remember from what I just said with tomatoes and calendula and alyssum, the lady beetles love to lay their eggs where there can be an aphid presence. And in my experience, aphids are really bad on peppers early in the season. And if we plant the peppers in the midst of carrots where the adult lady beetles have already found a safe haven, they're already there by the time we plant the peppers in the garden. And whether your peppers have aphids already on them, like mine tend to because I grow them in the greenhouse and aphids tend to be in the greenhouse lately, or you buy them from the garden center and the aphids just find the plant, this is a good companion because it helps those lady beetles to keep that aphid population in check. So this particular combination I saw worked so well last year. And like I said, it was only really the first time I've done it intentionally, but I'm going to be doing it again this year because I saw how well it worked last year. Number 4 is okra and celery. Now, this is another example of, this is technically a form of succession planting called relay planting, which, by the way, we go in depth into in Dream to Garden. I teach you all about all of this, but I also talk a little bit about it in the masterclass. So if you're confused about what I'm talking about, I explain it a lot today or tomorrow or Thursday in the masterclass. So check that out. But the way that I did celery and okra last year, it was kind of on a whim to see if this would work. but it worked so well. What I did is celery is similar to my other cool season crops in that I'm planting the celery transplants usually the middle to end of March. Even though they're a cool season crop, they don't like hot weather. They're a little bit more frost tender than the other cool season crops. I'd say freeze tender. I usually don't have any problem if around 28, below 28, they tend to not like that. So I'm usually planting them usually the middle to end of March, depending on the year. And then okra as a warm season crop that loves the heat, they don't get planted. Their seeds don't get planted till May when the soil warms up to 70, 75 at least. So again, we've got a good 6-8 weeks where the celery is getting all the sun it needs. It's enjoying that cool weather. And then we're planting the okra seeds at the time when it's really starting to heat up in May. Now, last year I was a little nervous about this because by the time it was time to plant the okra seeds, the celery plants were quite large. They were probably a foot tall, easy. And I was a little bit worried that the okra seeds wouldn't be able to get enough sunlight by the time it outgrew those celery plants. And I was a little nervous because they did look a little spindly at first. You could tell they were just trying to reach the light. And I don't know if it's just because I'm in the South and okra grows so well in the South, but it ended up doing great. They ended up getting taller than the celery, and then they started to flourish, which is about the same time that the heat sets in. And I ended up harvesting my celery. I'm thinking I harvested in June. In the past, I have had to harvest my celery early in the season before it got too hot, harvest it in June, and then if it came back and it bolted because celery doesn't like hot weather. Well, last year I found something very interesting that I've never had happen before. I don't know if it'll happen again, but it's very possible that there's a reason that this happened. And what ended up happening with that celery is even through our heat of the summer, 100 degrees, not uncommon, 90s and high humidity all throughout the summer, none of those celery plants bolted. In fact, they continued growing again, another flush of celery stalks. Now, those celery stalks were not as vibrant, they were not as crisp, they weren't like the first ones that I harvested. So don't get me wrong, but I still was able to use that celery for my Thanksgiving stuffing. I still was able to use it in the fall when I hadn't planned on having that as an option for my fall garden because I just assumed it would be done in my climate. And understand my climate, it's very specific because celery is hard to grow in my climate because it doesn't like the heat. Here's why I think okra and celery were really good companions. I think that by the time the heat that would have normally done the celery got here, the okra was tall enough to start casting a little bit of shade on the celery. Now, granted, the particular bed that I grew both of them did have a little bit more shade than the rest of the garden. It was next to a tree, so that may have helped, but I just found that to be a really interesting combination, and it worked so well last year. I am trying it again this year. I'm going to be trying it in a part of the garden that gets a little bit more sun, so we'll see if I have the same results. That'll be a good test to see, okay, was it the shade, like all the shade that really helped the celery, or was it that these two are just really good companions? So like I said, last year was my first year. I will be continuing to test it. But if you live in a climate where you have hot seasons and you found that celery is a little bit more difficult to grow, then this might be a combination you might want to consider for that reason to try to help extend that celery life and try to, shade those from the hot weather in the middle of the summer. Number 5 is a combination that everybody says you shouldn't do. And there's a reason why everyone says you shouldn't do this, but I'm going to tell you why I have done it in the past, why I'm going to do it this year, and why I think it's okay with a couple of little caveats here. And that is broccoli and cabbage. I know if I had sound effects, it'd be dun, 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 right? Broccoli and cabbage are on the no, you should never plant these together list. And I understand why. There's 2 reasons why I have seen these two be bad combinations. Number 1 is broccoli and cabbage are both very heavy feeders. They like nitrogen, they like ample amount of nutrition. And so if you plant them together and you plant them together in a bed that doesn't have enough nutrition to support them, neither of them will grow very well. Granted, they are heavy feeders. That could happen. But what if you plant them in a bed and you make sure they have enough fertility that will support both of them? Number two, the other reason that you see people saying don't plant these together is because the thought is that they attract the same pest, which is true. They attract the cabbage moth, which lays eggs that become the cabbage worms, and the cabbage worms will decimate your broccoli and your cabbage in short order. They're not a fun pest. Most people that I talk to that grow brassicas, they deal with it. So the thought is plant them in separate places so you won't have so much pest pressure. Okay, so I haven't done any scientific studies on this, so there may be something that can prove me wrong here, but here's my thought. In my experience with dealing with cabbage worms for almost a decade, I think, in my experience, that it wouldn't matter where these plants were planted. I think if I planted cabbage and then I decided to plant broccoli an acre over, I think the cabbage moth is still going to find it. Now, technically, there's a certain distance that these insects end up traveling, and all this is hyperbole, so don't say, well, they actually can't travel an acre. I don't know. My point is, every time I have planted cabbage and broccoli in separate spaces, the cabbage worm found them anyway. So my thought is, if I'm going to have to cover them anyway with an insect netting to prevent the cabbage moth from laying its egg on these crops, why not plant them in the same bed so I can use the same cover? That way I don't have to cover two different beds. Now, in the fall, I did plant one bed with broccoli and one bed with cabbage, and I used one long floating row cover. It ended up covering both. I mean, obviously that makes sense because I planted that many broccoli and that many cabbage. But in the springtime, I'm not going to be planting as many of each, and I can get them in one bed. And if that's the case, that's going to save me from having to cover multiple beds, because honestly, covers are amazing, but they're a pain in the butt sometimes to make sure that they're sealed and to get them on and all of this stuff. So I would rather just have to deal with one. Last year or the year before, I can't remember, I did plant cabbage and broccoli in the same bed, and I covered them, and they did perfectly fine. They had a great harvest. I spaced them appropriately, just like I would space anything else. And to me, if I'm not needing to plant a whole lot of them, I don't see a reason why I couldn't make it work planting in the same bed. So I've done it in the past. It's worked fine for me. I'm going to continue testing it, but I hope that you can kind of see my thought process behind all this. I wouldn't plant them in the same bed if I was worried about the soil quality, if I was worried that they would have enough nutrients, because that absolutely could make them not grow very well. But if the main reason is the pest, then I'm going to cover them anyway. So why not just cover one bed? So you can kind of see like almost the deductive reasoning that's going here. Obviously, I'm just, continuing to test it every single year, but that's one that I think should be considered if it works well for your space, instead of having to worry too much about keeping them too far separated. Honestly, if you're growing in a small garden space, how can you get them properly separated? I don't see the logic in all of that. And if you're talking about huge agriculture, maybe, but in a small garden space, how can you get them far enough away anyway? The moth flies, it's not like it crawls. Anyway, that's just, you can kind of see my little pet peeve with some of these bad companions that you see online. Test them yourself. Sometimes I've tested some bad companions and everything has been right. Like last year, I did peppers and cabbage together, and I've got I think it's a YouTube video or maybe an Instagram reel, I can't remember, but that explained why that wasn't a great combination. You can check that out. So all that to say, test different things. Test what I'm telling you. Don't just take my word for it. All right, number 6. This is something that I've done in the past, and I feel like it's a great combination, and that is determinate tomatoes and carrots. Now, specifically, I'm talking about determinate tomatoes like Roma tomatoes, because they are not going to grow super large and they're not going to overtake the space. Tomatoes and carrots are good combinations. I've planted them together in the past, but the times that I have not had great results with carrots is when I've planted tomatoes that have shaded the carrots. As I mentioned before, carrots need full sun. The way that I did it last year in particular was I planted a row of determinate tomatoes in a long raised bed, and then I planted the carrots in front of it so that way it got full morning sun. Now, of course, consider the timing. Like I said before, the carrot seeds were planted in early March. the tomatoes were not planted till mid-April. So the carrots did have some time by themselves before I planted the tomatoes. And then the tomatoes early in their life were small. But even as they grew to be at full maturity, they weren't too tall. They weren't overtaking the entire space like an indeterminate tomato would do. An indeterminate tomato is one like your Cherokee purple or your Brandywine or your San Marzanos, things like that. Your determinate tomatoes are going to stay one size. And that in my garden, kept the carrots where they were able to get full sun for the amount of time that they needed to. That's why I think determinate tomatoes and carrots are the best option. If you plant carrots with indeterminate tomatoes, just watch where the sun is and watch how much shade they potentially could get. I would definitely plant them in the spring. I would plant the carrots on the south side of any tomato. In that case, if I did indeterminate tomatoes, just keep an eye on that if you plant them together. I think that's why so many people think they see online tomatoes and carrots are great companions, and they are, but just don't forget that carrots, especially early in their growth, they need full sun. And finally, we have a combination of a cool season crop and a warm season crop that I've used in the past couple of years that have worked really well. And they're actually two companions for onions. In my garden, onions are typically planted in March, sometimes February. They can also be planted as late as April, although my April plantings never get huge bulbs. But anyway, just kind of give you some context on the timing. And sweet potatoes and okra are a couple of options to companion plant with onions. Again, this is technically more of a relay planting combination. But when they're growing together, there actually are good companions I have found. Again, I'm planting onions early March usually. I'm not planting sweet potatoes or okra until mid-May. So the onions have a good 2 months, if not more, of being by themselves, of having no competition. That's important for onions. They need all the space, weed-free, that they can get so that they can have all the access to the water, all the access to the nitrogen. That's what they need to grow big bulbs, is to have it all to themselves. But what I found is that when I can plant sweet potatoes or okra toward the end of the onions growing season, I feel like, this is just my observation, I feel like it has benefited the onions in two ways. Number one, by the time the onion is bulbing up, it doesn't need as much water. And the onion is definitely starting to bulb up at that point of the year when I'm planting my sweet potatoes and my okra, at least in my garden. So the sweet potatoes and the okra are helping to absorb any excess rainfall. So that's why I feel like this helps the onions not to get too water soaked, because if you get too much rain, especially toward the time that they're bulbing, they'll rot. That happens to me, or has happened to me a lot. And it's really kind of frustrating because you spend all that time really preparing for these onions and then they get too much rain and then they rot. And I'm not saying that they won't if you plant sweet potatoes and okra next to them. I'm saying it can help mitigate the effects of heavy rain. Number two is the okra and the sweet potatoes can help shade the soil around the onions. The soil can get really hot, especially if you are weeding, keeping the space clear. The soil can get really hot. Now, mulch is definitely helpful, but as the sweet potatoes start to grow all around the onions, and as the okra starts to grow, casting a shade on top of the onions, by that point, they don't need a whole lot of sun. They are maturing their bulb, so they're not in that leafy growth that's going to require a whole lot of sun. The shade that is produced helps to keep the soil temperature moderated, which I feel like helps the onions toward the last stage of their growth. In context, I'm usually harvesting my onions toward the end of June and into July. So the onions and the sweet potatoes and okra are only growing together for about a month. So yeah, there is maybe a month to 6 weeks. So there is some overlap where they are companions, but I feel like even in that small space, they are helping each other. Now, the important thing to understand, especially with these examples that I've given regarding what is essentially a relay planting, where I plant one thing and I leave room to plant the second thing a month or two later, is it's important to know what your climate is and how your climate functions. Because some climates, you'll be planting a lot of these things in much closer proximity in time than I will. And so it's really important for you to know your climate so that you can figure out if these companions, and especially if these relay plantings, would be the best choice for your garden. That's something that I touch on in the masterclass of how important it is to know the cool season crops, warm season crops, and a couple other things that, people don't talk about online that I think is critical when it comes to your climate. So I talked to you about how to know your climate and then what crops are going to be best for your climate. But then in Dream to Garden, I actually teach you how to learn what your climate is and adapt some of these strategies, such as relay planting, succession planting, companion planting, to work with you in your climate, because some of these combinations may not work as well in your location as they will for me. Now, some of them will work regardless, and some of these principles are the same regardless, but some may need to be tweaked based on you and your climate. This is something that I really like to emphasize because I think it's where beginners sometimes will find that they're not as successful as they want to be because they truly don't understand their climate and how these crops fit into that and how to help those crops thrive in the place that they're at while doing the companion planting and the succession planting and maximizing your space and all of this. It can get a little bit overwhelming. That's what I like to try to do, is simplify it for you and try to make it where you can work out this plan, get your plan done. So that way, when it's time to plant, all you have to do is look on your calendar and you can see when to plant. We're going to be talking more about that in the masterclass. And again, I dive deep on this in Dream to Garden. If you're like, okay, just give me the course, I want to dive right in, you can go to journeywithjill.net/dream-to-garden. But if you still want to know more about these concepts, please join me in the masterclass. And again, don't forget, giveaway just for registering. You'll have a replay that'll be available through February 13th if you register for the masterclass. And you can just register for whichever one works best for you. It's all the same content, but whichever time works best for you. I would love to see you live in the masterclass. I hope that these combinations have given you some food for thought. If you have others that you have found that have worked well for you in your garden, or maybe if you've tried some of the ones that I shared and they didn't work for whatever reason, list those in the comments if you're watching on YouTube. Message me on Instagram if you're just listening on the podcast, and I'd love to hear back from you. I feel like it's really important for us to observe and learn from each other, and I look forward to hearing from you. All right, thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope to see you either today, tomorrow, or Thursday in the Productive Garden Masterclass. Again, journeywithjill.net/masterclass, or in my online garden planning course, Dream to Garden. Have a great day.